The target, Karoline's first day. Karoline Levitt exited the black SUV, the significance of her new post a tangible weight, thick as the deep sea of humidity. Sunlight blazed off the west wing, an emblem of authority, today symbolizing her trial by fire. Her heels tapped a staccato rhythm on the driveway, the sound seeming to echo in the tense atmosphere. Anticipation wrestled with a queasy apprehension. The day had arrived. Her debut as press secretary. She smoothed the lapel of her tailored blazer, a reflexive gesture of composure. Meticulous preparation had only partially blunted the impact of her expanded role, the sheer magnitude of the office, and no longer just a commentator. Every utterance, every nuance would be scrutinized, deconstructed, and potentially weaponized. Inside, the West Wing throbbed with carefully orchestrated frenzy. Aides zipped past, phones glued to their ears, faces a study in urgency and intent. The air carried a faint tang of roasted coffee and desperation. Karoline navigated the well-worn corridors, acknowledging the Secret Service detail with a nod. The subtle aroma of aged leather and polished wood provided a grounding connection to the institution's legacy, a legacy she now embodied. Her office, surprisingly intimate, offered a vista of the rose garden. She envisioned imbuing the space with her own personality, shaping it into a sanctuary for clear thought and strategic planning. That a family photograph anchored the desk, a poignant reminder of her motivations. They were her haven. Amid the turbulence of Washington, a mountain of briefing documents awaited, stark evidence of the day's challenges. She skimmed the headlines, stalled trade talks with China, escalating tensions in the Middle East, unsettling poll numbers, each a potential powder keg. Her team had already congregated in the adjoining conference room, a cadre of sharp, driven individuals devoted to advancing the president's agenda. Sarah, the deputy press secretary, possessed a veteran's savvy and a rapier wit. Mark, the communications director, was a maestro of messaging and perception. And Emily, the social media strategist, wielded the power of a perfectly crafted tweet. "All right, team," Karoline began, her tone even and assured. "Let's dive in." She indicated the briefing stack. "We're all aware of the agenda. China, Iran, the usual suspects. But my focus is on the underlying narrative. What core messages do we want to hammer home today? And how do we preempt the inevitable resistance?" Sarah spoke first, her voice crisp and direct. "China will prove the most difficult. They're entrenched on the trade agreement. We must project the president's unwavering resolve and unyielding." Mark echoed. "We need to position the Iran situation as vital to national security. The president safeguards American interests." Emily added, "I've pre-drafted tweets emphasizing the economic upswing resulting from the president's policies." Karoline absorbed their contributions, listening intently. She valued her team's insights, yet the ultimate accountability rested squarely on her shoulders. She needed to anticipate every query, every assault. "Okay," she said, leaning forward, "let's address the press corps. Which amongst them do we expect to be the most combative?" A collective sigh filled the room. Sarah's eyes rolled skyward. "Chad Lawson, without question, that he's been relentless lately, portraying the president as detached from reality." Chad Lawson. The name lingered, a shadow cast across an otherwise promising horizon. That a correspondent for the Washington Post. He was known for his unwavering pursuit of truth, or at least his interpretation of it. Incisive, articulate, and utterly fearless, he considered himself a guardian against abuses of power, dedicated to exposing perceived falsehoods and hypocrisy in the president's administration. Karoline had tracked Lawson's career for years. She respected his diligence, even when disagreeing with his conclusions. She anticipated a rigorous challenge, an attempt to unnerve her, to exploit any perceived vulnerability. He wouldn't settle for mere points. He'd aim for a knockout. "Right," she said, her tone hardening. "Let's be prepared. That I want a comprehensive profile on Lawson. Every piece he's published, every interview he's granted, that I need to understand his motivations." The team nodded in agreement. They recognized the stakes. This went beyond defending the president. It was about safeguarding their own integrity, their own professional standing. Following the meeting, Karoline sought refuge in her office. The pile of Lawson's articles loomed on her desk, a formidable obstacle. She lifted the first one, a searing indictment of the president's economic strategies that as she read. A grudging admiration for Lawson's prose took root. He possessed a mastery of language, interweaving facts and anecdotes into a compelling narrative. But it was a skewed narrative. She argued, prejudiced. He saw only what reinforced his biases, neglecting the beneficial aspects of the president's initiatives. For hours, she immersed herself in Lawson's body of work, dissecting his arguments, second-guessing his lines of inquiry. She searched for recurring themes, inconsistencies, points of weakness. She needed to discover a way to defuse his attacks, to potentially twist his own words against him. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the rose garden. A coolness settled into the office, a sharp contrast to the day's earlier warmth. Karoline sank back in her chair, her eyes strained, her thoughts churning. She had prepared as thoroughly as possible, yet recognized the unpredictable nature of the press briefing. It was a high-stakes arena, and she stood poised to enter it. She conjured images of her family, their steadfast support. She thought of the president, his faith in her, and she reflected on the American people, those she was sworn to represent. She refused to disappoint them. Drawing a steadying breath, she rose, straightened her blazer, and proceeded towards the door. The moment of truth had arrived. It was time to confront Chad Lawson. The hunter. Chad's preparation. The fluorescent lights of the Washington Standard newsroom hummed, casting a sterile glow on Chad Sterling's meticulously organized desk. A chaotic swirl of highlighted articles, meticulously notated briefing papers, and half-empty coffee cups surrounded his standing desk. Chad tapped a manicured fingernail against a printout of one of Trump's older, more inflammatory tweets. He wasn't just preparing for a press briefing. He was preparing for a hunt. So, you're going full bore on the economic anxiety angle. His editor, Evelyn Reed, leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed. Evelyn, a seasoned journalist with a weary but sharp gaze, served as Chad's counterbalance. Again, Chad swiveled, his chair groaning in protest. Evelyn, with all due respect, it's not again that it's consistent. Their policies disproportionately affect working-class families, despite the populist rhetoric. He gestured to the tweet. This is a gold mine of contradictions. America first, while lining the pockets of corporations who outsource jobs overseas. It's blatant hypocrisy. Evelyn sighed, adjusting her glasses. Blatant hypocrisy is practically the administration's brand at this point. Chad, you need to bring something new to the table. Something that sticks. That's exactly what I intend to do, Chad said, his voice a low purr. He tapped the screen of his laptop, bringing up a detailed spreadsheet charting the president's past pronouncements on trade, manufacturing, and job creation. I've cross-referenced his promises with actual economic data. The numbers don't lie, Evelyn. They paint a clear picture of broken promises and a widening gap between the haves and have-nots. Numbers are boring, Chad. You need a human angle. A victim, something the viewers can connect with. Chad conceded the point with a curt nod that he had already prepped his opening question, designed to be both pointed and subtly accusatory, alluding to specific instances of factory closures in key swing states that he envisioned the headline. Trump's empty promises, a closer look at economic disparity that he spent the next hour immersed in the digital archives, sifting through the president's speeches, interviews, and town hall appearances. Each phrase, each gesture, each carefully crafted soundbite was dissected and analyzed for potential vulnerabilities. He was looking for the chink in the armor, the unguarded moment that would reveal the truth beneath the carefully constructed facade. A truth, in Chad's mind, that involved the administration's deliberate disinterest in the plight of the marginalized. Later, Chad migrated toward the water cooler, a strategic gathering spot for journalists looking for scoops and sharing intel. He spotted Maria Rodriguez from Global News Today and Ben Carter from the Associated Press. "Morning, folks," Chad greeted, feigning nonchalance as he filled his reusable water bottle. "Big day tomorrow. First official briefing with a new press secretary. Maria raised an eyebrow. Levitt, right? Heard she's a shark. Been prepping for weeks. Chad chuckled. I'm sure she has, but preparation can only take you so far that it's about the questions you ask, not the answers you expect. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. I'm planning on pressing her hard on the administration's economic policies, specifically the broken promises to the Rust Belt. Ben, ever the pragmatist, chimed in. Good luck with that. Chad, they've got a spin for everything. You'll need more than just outrage to break through. Outrage is a powerful motivator, Ben, Chad retorted, his voice hardening slightly. And I have facts to back it up. What about you? What are you planning to grill her on? Ben shrugged, still deciding. Maybe immigration. Maybe the latest environmental regulations rollback. Maria nodded in agreement. Those are solid angles, but Levitt will be ready for them. Everyone will be. Chad smirked, swirling the water in his bottle. That's the beauty of it. Everyone expects the obvious, and no one expects the knockout blow. He paused for dramatic effect. I intend to make her sweat. T.O. force her to defend the indefensible. T.O. expose the truth. As he walked back to his desk, Chad felt a surge of adrenaline. The hunter was ready. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it. He glanced at a small, framed photograph on his desk. A picture of his younger sister, who struggled with student debt after his parents lost their home in the 2008 financial crisis. It was a reminder of what he was fighting for. Who he was fighting for, that he wasn't just a journalist. He was a voice for the voiceless, a champion for the downtrodden. He would not let them down. He couldn't. Collision course. The briefing begins. A collective buzz filled the room. A low thrum of anticipation that resonated from the floor to the tightly packed rows of folding chairs. The air, a cloying blend of perfume and anxious perspiration, felt stale despite the hum of the overtaxed air conditioning. 3 rows from the front. Chad's fingers performed a nervous drum solo on his notepad. The sharp, coppery taste of adrenaline flooded his mouth at a restless night of mental sparring. Honing his inquiries to a razor's edge had left him. Drained, the specter of his father's perpetual disapproval haunted his waking and sleeping hours. The side door swung open, silencing the room. Karoline Levitt appeared, both recognizable and strangely transformed under the pitiless glare of the TV cameras. Her impeccably tailored suit, a shade of corporate blue, seemed to swallow her. She advanced with an ingrained self-assurance that didn't quite reach her gaze. Her eyes darted around, a fleeting moment of vulnerability before locking onto the teleprompter. Good morning, she announced, her voice amplified, saturated with synthetic enthusiasm. Welcome to today's briefing. I have a brief statement regarding the administration's recent efforts toward economic improvement, after which I'll be happy to address your queries. Chad barely acknowledged her prepared words, his focus a laser beam on the impending cue, and he clutched his pen, the plastic biting into his skin. He recalled Evelyn's directive. Find the human angle, Chad. Make them care. But all he could summon was an icy indignation. He didn't need sentiment, he held the truth. Karoline concluded her pronouncements. A meticulously crafted narrative of increasing prosperity and decreasing joblessness. Data points that felt like a personal affront. And with that, she finished, a brittle smile momentarily gracing her lips. We'll open the floor. A dozen hands shot up, a thicket of ambition. Karoline surveyed the assembly, her gaze briefly alighting on a sympathetic face from Fox News. But Chad, propelled by mounting frustration, was already rising from his seat. Ms. Levitt, he called out, his voice piercing the polite din. Chad Sterling, the American Chronicle. Can you speak to the administration's controversial choice to slash funding for SNAP, given these rosy economic gains you just presented? The room fell silent. Not the first question, but certainly the most pointed. Chad witnessed Karoline's carefully constructed composure falter. The flash of irritation flickered across her features, swiftly masked by practiced poise. She inhaled deliberately. Mr. Sterling, thank you for the question. As the president has stated time and again, we are dedicated to responsible spending. The adjustments to the SNAP program are intended to encourage capable adults to return to the workforce, thereby contributing to the overall economy. Chad snorted softly, a dismissive sound that resonated in the sudden quiet. Encourage by depriving them of food? Isn't that simply penalizing the impoverished for their poverty? Karoline's jawline hardened. The purpose is not punitive, Mr. Sterling. The purpose is to ensure responsible use of taxpayer money, that we are investing in educational initiatives and resources to assist individuals in gaining stable employment. Investing, Chad challenged, leaning forward, his gaze unwavering. Or rerouting funds into tax breaks for the wealthy, lining the pockets of her donors while families struggle to feed themselves. The data is irrefutable, Ms. Levitt. Food banks are reporting unprecedented needs. Are you really suggesting that cutting SNAP benefits is helping anyone? He spotted a single drop of perspiration trace a path down Karoline's temple. She subtly dabbed it away with a tissue. Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, your portrayal of the situation is inaccurate, that we are working with facts. For example, SNAP enrollment has decreased by almost 5% since last quarter. This is connected to the increase in employment rates we are seeing across the nation. Chad gripped his pen harder. Statistics, she was weaponizing numbers, hiding behind a smokescreen of data. But he possessed first-hand knowledge that he knew the stories behind those figures, that he knew the persistent hunger they represented. And what of those unable to find work, Ms. Levitt? What of the infirm, the elderly, the single mothers struggling to support their families? Are they merely acceptable losses in your pursuit of fiscal responsibility? He felt the weight of the room's attention. A blend of fascination and unease. He had landed the first blow. The air crackled with the promise of genuine conflict. Karoline's tone sharpened, losing its veneer of calm. The administration is dedicated to supporting all Americans. Mr. Sterling, do we have a safety net in place for those who truly require assistance? However, we also believe in individual accountability, that we believe in the power of work. And we believe that these policies will ultimately serve the best interests of everyone. Chad understood this was only the opening skirmish. He had countless more questions, countless more accusations simmering just below the surface. He was ready for a prolonged battle, and he suspected, with a sense of grim satisfaction, that Karoline Levitt was too. Deflection and escalation. The immigration tweet. Karoline leaned into the microphone, her smile fixed despite the beads of sweat glistening on her brow. With all due respect, Mr. Sterling, your grim depiction simply doesn't jibe with the numbers that unemployment's dipped, manufacturing's bouncing back, and GDP growth has spiked. The SNAP is a trampoline, not a couch, that we're helping people get back on their feet and contribute. Chad shifted, the whisper of leather against tweed a subtle counterpoint to her polished pronouncements. He loathed that smile, a carbon copy of his father's preemptive bomb before delivering a verbal sting. Ms. Levitt, with all due respect, those are boardroom abstractions. I'm talking about flesh and blood people, entire families lining up for handouts in queues that stretch longer every week. You can't feed a family on GDP reports. He stabbed the air with his index finger. A rustle of whispers rippled through the assembled reporters. The few heads bobbed in agreement. Karoline held her ground, her gaze unwavering. Through targeted skills programs and incentives for businesses, we're directly addressing those family struggles, that we're refining the system, making sure aid reaches those who need it most while fostering independence. She launched a salvo of policy acronyms: WIA, TNF, EITC, each a verbal dart aimed at Chad's accusations. Frustration prickled at Chad. She was adept. Too slick, an answer for everything. A statistic for every heartbreaking story. He needed to puncture that veneer of calculated calm, find a vulnerability. He amplified his volume slightly. But won't these proposed eligibility changes unfairly burden minority communities and single-parent homes? Karoline hesitated, her smile flickering for the briefest moment. The revisions are designed for responsible use of taxpayer funds and to encourage workforce participation across every demographic group. Her composure snapped back into place. We are dedicated to equitable outcomes for every American. Equitable outcomes? Chad's scoff echoed in the packed room. Is that your euphemism? Restricting food for vulnerable people while simultaneously handing tax cuts to billionaires. His pulse hammered, blood surging to his temples. The carefully nurtured righteous anger thrummed within him, a tangible force that Karoline's knuckles whitened as she gripped the podium. Mr. Sterling, those are hackneyed, partisan refrains. This administration is dedicated to fiscal prudence and cultivating an environment where every American can flourish. Chad was beyond listening. He was riding a wave. Fueled by the compulsion to expose what he saw as rank hypocrisy, he leaned forward, his voice gaining intensity. Let's pivot, then, Ms. Levitt. Let's discuss immigration. The atmosphere in the room thickened palpably. The murmurs escalated into a low, anticipatory thrum. Chad knew he was crossing a line, wading in a ground more treacherous than food stamp reductions. But he was unable to halt himself. In 2017, then-President Trump tweeted, and I quote, "When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us, that they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, that they're rapists." Ms. Levitt, Chad articulated, his voice dripping with acid. Would you care to defend that sentiment? Karoline's face transformed into a rigid mask of controlled fury. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw clenched. She drew a slow, measured breath. Mr. Sterling, we are gathered here to address the administration's economic strategies and its dedication to alleviating poverty. That I fail to perceive the relevance of a 5-year-old tweet to this conversation. Relevance? Chad erupted, abandoning any pretense of impartial reporting. It's profoundly relevant. It speaks directly to this administration's core values, or the glaring absence thereof. It's an unabashed exhibition of racism and xenophobia. Does the administration endorse those comments? He was yelling now, his voice resounding throughout the chamber. He was beyond caring. He had her cornered. He could perceive it in the sliver of uncertainty in her eyes, in the slight tremor of her hand as she adjusted the microphone. Karoline's voice was a low, even keel, a perilous calm descending over her features. Mr. Sterling, I will not dignify that rabble-rousing tirade with a response. The President has unequivocally stated his commitment to securing our borders and enforcing our immigration laws. These policies are sculpted to safeguard American citizens and guarantee a fair and judicious immigration system. So, no apology? Chad persisted, his voice brittle with scorn. No acknowledgement that those statements were damaging and prejudiced. Is this the benchmark the administration sets for acceptable dialogue? Is this the message you wish to broadcast to the world? He paused, allowing the silence to weigh heavily in the space. He scanned the room, locking eyes with his peers, searching for a signal of approval, of vindication of his conduct. He observed a blend of shock, fascination, and even a trace of admiration. But he also discerned something else, something that caused a knot to form in his stomach, a flicker of disquiet, a silent questioning of whether he had overstepped the mark. The wild card. Trump enters the fray. I stand by my statement that the tweet was misconstrued, Karoline declared, her voice a taut wire. The briefing room's harsh illumination bounced off the polished podium, highlighting a faint shimmer on her brow. Avoiding Chad's gaze, she fixed her attention on a point just beyond him, a trick honed in debate club to project an air of command. Misconstrued, Chad retorted, adjusting his spectacles. It explicitly vilified a group of immigrants, using unsavory language we needn't repeat, Ms. Levitt. How do you reconcile that with an economic plan supposedly designed for all? A ripple of unrest spread through the assembly. Flashbulbs popped. The assembled journalists, sensing a quarry at bay, angled forward, pens raised, a mixture of eagerness and concern etched on their features. Even her own staff, usually a bulwark of unwavering support, seemed uneasy. Karoline drew a steadying breath, determined to maintain her equilibrium. This was Chad's objective, precisely, to force her into a corner, defending the indefensible. The former president has previously addressed this, she stated, her voice regaining some of its earlier firmness. His words were regrettable. However, they do not represent the current administration's ethos or direction. Regrettable is at the extent of it. Chad pressed. People's lives were shattered, their security taken, because of policies inspired by that very rhetoric. Regrettable is a disservice to those directly impacted. He was relentless, a dog worrying a bone. Frustration surged within Karoline, a fierce impulse to silence him, to quell his accusations. But she knew that path led only to deeper trouble. "Our priority is the future," she responded, her tone carefully modulated. "We are committed to fostering economic opportunities for all Americans, irrespective of origin. The expansion of SNAP, the innovative job programs we've detailed." Suddenly, a jarring blast of static filled the room, silencing all other sound. Every head snapped up, frozen mid-motion. Karoline's stomach clenched. What was happening? Then a voice, instantly recognizable, reverberated through the speakers, the voice that had once captivated headlines, a voice still potent enough to command attention, to ignite controversy. "Hello? Hello? Can anybody hear me?" It was Trump. That a collective intake of breath swept the room. Jaws slackened. Eyes widened in disbelief. Karoline stood transfixed, her mind reeling in the face of the impossible. This couldn't be real. Not like this. Chad Sterling, for the first time since the briefing commenced, registered genuine shock. His mouth gaped slightly, his characteristic smirk replaced with an expression of sheer astonishment. He scanned the room, searching for the source, as though expecting Trump to materialize from thin air. "I'm hearing some very unfair things being said," Trump continued, his voice amplified to a distorted caricature. "Very, very unfair. About me, about my accomplishments, and frankly, about the hard-working people who helped make America great." He paused, and in that sliver of silence, Karoline felt a wave of nausea crest within her. This was a debacle, a monumental disaster. "This SNAP thing, it's a complete sham," Trump declared. "People are abusing the system, living like royalty, eating high-end food, all at the expense of hard-working taxpayers. It's outrageous. We need to get tough. We need to clamp down on the free riders and ensure that help is reserved for the truly deserving." He chuckled, a rasping sound that crawled along Karoline's nerves. "And about that tweet, well, sometimes you have to be blunt. Sometimes you have to speak candidly. People may dislike honesty, but frankly, that's their concern, not mine." He paused again, and Karoline could almost visualize his self-satisfied smirk. "So, I simply wish to clarify and to assure everyone that I remain engaged, that I continue to fight for the American people, and I'm not going anywhere." The line went dead. The speakers emitted a high-pitched whine. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the relentless staccato of camera shutters and the shallow breaths of the assembled journalists. All eyes were fixed on Karoline, awaiting her response, wondering what words she could possibly conjure. Chad Sterling slowly turned his gaze back to her, his eyes narrowed, a calculating spark flickering within their depths. The initial shock had dissipated, replaced by an intensity of purpose that he understood, as did everyone present, that the rules had shifted, and Karoline Leavitt was now engaged in an entirely different game, with far higher stakes. The unexpected pivot. A moment of humility? The feed flickered to life, resolving into a sun-drenched tableau. Trump, before a backdrop of riotous roses. His image carefully curated for approachability. IT was a far cry from the combative figure Karoline anticipated. "A lot of folks are talking about the border," he began, the familiar cadence a blend of nonchalance and command. "And let me be crystal, border security is paramount. Our citizens deserve protection. Weakness is unacceptable. The stakes are too high." Chad Sterling straightened, a glint of anticipation sharpening his features. He attacked his notepad, crafting his confrontational query. Here it was, Trump, obliging him, doubling down on the rhetoric that inflamed passions. He shot a glance at Karoline, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He could already envision the headline. Trump remains unyielding on divisive immigration policies. This promised to be a grueling day for the press secretary, a victorious one for truth, as Chad saw it. Now, Trump continued, pausing to delicately divest a spent bloom from a nearby bush. There was a tweet. "You all know the one. And look, I'm a scrapper. Always have been I fight for this country." But he paused, seemingly grappling with the sentiment. An abrupt stillness fell over the briefing room. Karoline, primed for a fiery defense, experienced a jolt of surprise. The chilled air seemed to intensify. She gripped the podium's edge, her fingers bone-white. Sometimes, Trump finally stated, a gentler tone than Karoline had ever witnessed. Words can be misconstrued. They can inflict pain. That was never my intent. If that tweet caused distress, if it offended anyone, then I offer my sincere apology. The words lingered, weighted with unexpected contrition. Chad Sterling's pen faltered, leaving a splotch of ink blooming across the page. His jaw clenched, then loosened, a dawning unease clouding his expression. This deviated sharply from his prepared script. This was not the predictable Trump unleash he had anticipated. A reporter from a smaller publication stifled a cough, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Trump pressed on, his gaze direct, almost pleading for understanding. We need unity, we need healing, we need a stronger, more united America. That begins with empathy, with truly hearing one another, and with owning our errors. We can't remain mired in the past. We must look ahead, and America's prospects are radiant. He even offered a slight, almost sheepish smile. A dizzying wave swept over Karoline. Relief battled incredulity. Was this a calculated play, a canny feint to disarm his critics? Or was it genuine remorse? She couldn't decipher it. But whatever the cause, it had irrevocably disrupted the meticulously planned briefing. Chad Sterling's notebook snapped shut, the sound reverberating in the stunned silence. His face burned, his eyes narrowed with resentment. He felt duped. He'd been so certain, so confident that Trump would provide the inflammatory material he craved. Now, the terrain felt dangerously unstable as he glared at Karoline, his gaze a silent accusation that he couldn't gauge her thoughts, but the barest hint of a smile curved. Her lips, that it was a smile that ignited his fury. That it suggested he'd been outmaneuvered, that his carefully cultivated indignation had been manipulated. The broadcast abruptly cut, replaced by the official White House seal. A prolonged silence gripped the room, the atmosphere thick with unspoken questions and dashed expectations. Karoline inhaled deeply, striving to regain her composure. "Well," she said, her voice surprisingly firm, "that was unforeseen. As you have just witnessed, the president is dedicated to cohesion and to progress." She hesitated, searching for a way to salvage the situation, to redirect the conversation towards the administration's economic agenda. Now, returning to the subject of the SNAP modifications. But the room remained deaf to her words. All eyes were fixed on Chad Sterling, frozen in his seat, his face a rigid mask of suppressed fury. He resembled a vanquished combatant, the hunter, now the quarry. And Karoline, for the first time since accepting this impossible post, felt a nascent flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could navigate this treacherous terrain after all. Perhaps she had a narrow opening to actually effect some positive change. Lost momentum. Chad's faltering attack. The air in the briefing room, thick with anticipation moments before, had thinned considerably. Trump's unexpected mea culpa hung in the air like a deflated balloon. Chad Sterling, feeling the wind knocked out of his sails, fumbled for purchase. "Mr. President," Chad began, his voice a touch higher than usual, a tremor betraying the carefully cultivated image of unflappable journalistic integrity. "With all due respect, a tweet apology hardly addresses the real-world consequences of—" He trailed off, glancing at his notes, the carefully crafted questions suddenly feeling stale. Karoline watched him, a tiny, almost imperceptible, flicker of something akin to pity crossing her features. It vanished so quickly, Chad couldn't be sure he'd seen it. "Mr. Sterling," she prompted, her tone even professional. You were saying? He cleared his throat, forcing a renewed sharpness into his voice. The administration continues to tout economic improvement, yet simultaneously proposes significant cuts to SNAP benefits. How can you reconcile these two seemingly contradictory positions? Are you suggesting that people who rely on food assistance are somehow not benefiting from this supposed economic boom? The question, while pointed, lacked the lethal precision he'd aimed for. It felt generic that he saw a few reporters, who had been leaning forward expectantly, begin to shift in their seats, their attention waning. Karoline seized the opening. Mr. Sterling, as you know, the president is committed to fiscal responsibility. We believe that a strong economy, coupled with targeted job training programs, will ultimately provide individuals with sustainable pathways out of poverty, making them less reliant on government assistance in the long run. These are not cuts. They are adjustments designed to incentivize work and self-sufficiency. She delivered the line smoothly, a well-rehearsed response that, under normal circumstances, Chad would have dissected with relish. But his mind felt sluggish, his arguments blunted. He tried a different tack. But what about the immediate impact? These adjustments, as you call them, will directly affect millions of vulnerable Americans. Are you prepared to accept the potential rise in food insecurity, the increased hardship on families already struggling to make ends meet? Another missed. He could practically hear the air leaking out of his argument. He saw Sarah Miller from the Associated Press stifle a yawn. Karoline, sensing his floundering, offered a lifeline, a move so unexpected it momentarily threw him further off balance. Mr. Sterling, I'd appreciate your concern for those who rely on SNAP. Perhaps, to clarify, you could specify which proposed adjustments you are referring to. There are several different proposals being discussed, and a more specific question will allow me to provide a more accurate and helpful response. He stared at her, momentarily speechless. Was she helping him? The gesture felt condescending, a subtle undermining of his authority. He felt his cheeks flushed. He hated her. The proposed reduction in eligibility criteria, he finally managed, his voice tight. The tightening of work requirements. The elimination of broad-based categorical eligibility. He rattled off the points, feeling like he was reciting a grocery list. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, Karoline replied, her tone maddeningly reasonable. Now, regarding those specific points, she launched into a detailed explanation, citing statistics and policy papers, effectively filibustering any further attempts at pointed questioning. Chad felt a surge of frustration. He'd come prepared to expose the administration's callous disregard for the poor, to paint a vivid picture of the human cost of their policies. Instead, he was being bogged down in bureaucratic details, his momentum completely lost. Other reporters, sensing blood in the water, or rather, the lack thereof, began to redirect their questions to other topics. The upcoming trade talks with China, the president's stance on climate change, anything but Chad's sputtering investigation into SNAP cuts. He tried to interject, to steer the conversation back to the issue he felt so passionately about, but his voice was drowned out by the rising tide of other questions that he felt a cold dread creep into his stomach. He was losing. Karoline effortlessly fielded the other questions. Her gaze flickered towards Chad. A ghost of a smile played on her lips. He looked away, his hands clenching in a fist. He'd walked in confident, ready for a fight, ready to expose hypocrisy. Now, he felt exposed himself, his carefully constructed facade of righteous indignation crumbling around him. The room was hot, the lights too bright, and the buzzing of the fluorescent tubes overhead seemed to amplify his humiliation. He was losing his grip, and he knew it. The narrative he had so carefully constructed was slipping away, and Karoline Levitt, with her calm demeanor and calculated responses, was watching him drown. Seizing control, Karoline's counteroffensive. The silence stretched, burdened by the lingering echo of Karoline's near apology, a salve, perhaps, for Chad's perceived density. Unspoken accusations hung in the air, breeding like mold under the harsh glare of the briefing room lights. Her pen tapped a staccato rhythm against the papers before her, a subtle assertion of command. Right, she said, her voice regaining its customary edge. Let's pivot to something fruitful. I trust you're all keen to hear about the administration's continued strides in bolstering the American economy. She launched into a prepared statement, a litany of statistics detailing job growth, shrinking unemployment figures, and surging consumer sentiment. Each number was a meticulously crafted brick intended to construct a bulwark against earlier criticisms. Her tone, buoyant and optimistic, almost dismissed the snap cuts as a mere blip on the radar of a thriving economic landscape. A crimson flush crept up Chad's neck as he shifted. He began to interrupt, but Karoline, anticipating him, forestalled the attempt with an upraised hand. Chad, with all due respect, it's my floored. We'll have ample opportunity for questions anon, that I promise. The promise was a slick veneer of insincerity. His jaw tightened, cords standing out at his neck. He yearned to erupt, to demand justification, to expose the charade. But something restrained him. Was it the sting of her earlier condescension? The knowledge of the lenses trained on him, poised to capture a meltdown? Or a whisper of uncertainty, suggesting he might have overstepped his bounds? Karoline pressed on, her voice unwavering. She addressed tax incentives for budding enterprises, infrastructure initiatives generating employment, and the administration's dedication to fostering innovation. She even wove in carefully curated anecdotes of everyday citizens purportedly benefiting from these policies, tales engineered to elicit empathy. Gradually, a shift rippled through the room. The palpable tension around the SNAP reductions began to dissipate, giving way to a broader interest in the overall economic health. Maria Rodriguez from the AP, a veteran journalist known for her sharp inquiries, raised her hand. Ms. Levitt, Maria began, could you delve into the administration's long-term strategy for combating inflation? The latest CPI report revealed a slight climb, and economists are voicing concerns regarding its potential effects on consumer habits. Karoline's eyes sparkled with renewed vigor. This was her domain, a meaty question, ripe for a factual retort, an opportunity to showcase the administration's prowess. She embarked upon a comprehensive discourse on fiscal and monetary policy, peppering her response with sophisticated, albeit slightly obscure, terminology. Other reporters followed suit, interrogating her on trade pacts, energy regulations, and the national debt. The briefing morphed into a dense discussion of economic intricacies, a far cry from the initial face-off. The focal point had been diverted, the narrative commandeered, and Karoline was now securely at the helm. Chad sat in rigid silence, the sensation of isolation intensifying. He scribbled furiously, trying to retrieve something, anything, from the wreckage of his aborted attack. But the queries no longer centered on SNAP, nor on the impoverished and vulnerable. They concerned abstract principles, raw data, the very subjects that made his head swim. He scanned the faces of his colleagues, brows knitted in thought, pens dancing across their notepads. He felt like an outsider, an interloper in a sphere of professionals and insiders. Had he misjudged the situation? Had his fervor impaired his judgment? His gaze settled on Karoline, now responding to a query regarding the administration's strategy for addressing the skills shortage in the labor market. She was in her element, poised, articulate, and utterly in command. He detected a flicker in her gaze, a fleeting glance in his direction, a hint of a smile that vanished almost immediately. Was it triumph, compassion, or something indefinable? He couldn't decipher it. All that he knew was that he had been outmaneuvered, outwitted, and thoroughly humbled. The righteous indignation that had spurred him on earlier had yielded to a nagging feeling of inadequacy, a sense that he lacked the skill, the intellect, the fortitude to challenge the administration successfully. The briefing wore on, the volley of questions and answers washing over him like an unstoppable current. He felt himself succumbing, drowning in an ocean of statistics and jargon. He closed his notebook, the fight seeping from him, defeated, at least for the time being. But he knew, with a conviction that burned in his core, that this was not the end of the line, that he would return. He simply needed to devise a different tack, a fresh plan, a novel way to unearth the Truth. And next time, Karoline Leavitt would not gain the upper hand. Next time, he would be prepared. Aftermath, repercussions, and reflections. Karoline delivered her closing smile, a polished, almost artificial beam that invariably signaled adjournment. Thank you all for your time. We'll see you next week. Gathering her meticulously compiled briefing book, its leather cover cool and smooth beneath her touch, she pivoted. The sharp tap of her heels punctuated the sudden hush as reporters began to regroup. The briefing room detonated behind her, a maelstrom of rising voices, the screech of chairs, and hushed postmortems filled the void. Karoline didn't glance back. Her performance was complete for the moment. She slipped into her office, the door clicking shut, a final barrier against the clamor. The distinctive aroma of lemon wax and high-end carpeting, a scent that had evolved from a novelty to an inescapable presence, greeted her. She sank in her chair, the leather groaning softly in response. The phone was already shrilling. "Leavitt," she answered, her voice clipped and professional. "Karoline, fantastic. You completely neutralized Sterling," her senior advisor, Mark, effused. That barrage of data points was a masterstroke. He was utterly blindsided. Karoline permitted herself a fleeting, almost invisible smile. "Thank you, Mark. Standard procedure." The boss is thrilled, absolutely ecstatic that he's already firing off tweets. Something about Crooked Chad getting a lesson from the best. You might want to brace yourself. Karoline felt a familiar weariness settle in. Presidential tweets were a double-edged sword, amplifying the message while sacrificing nuance and, frequently, dignity. "Duly noted, Mark. Thanks for the heads up." She ended the call and reluctantly navigated to Twitter. Precisely as predicted, there it was. Crooked Chad Sterling tried to undermine our fantastic economy, and the best press secretary ever demolished him. #MAGA, #winning. The response was immediate, a virulent tide of praise and condemnation. Karoline skimmed the comments, bracing against the inevitable personal assaults. Across town, Chad Sterling was weathering a different kind of storm. His phone vibrated relentlessly. Initially, the notifications were supportive, colleagues, activist allies, even a few academics lauding his persistence and dedication to accountability. But the mood shifted swiftly. Right-wing pundits were tearing him apart online, branding him a radical leftist, a snowflake, and a purveyor of fake news. Conservative blogs dissected his inquiries, distorting his words, and accusing him of deliberately misrepresenting cuts to SNAP benefits. The mainstream press offered little respite. While some acknowledged the sharpness of his questions, others criticized his delivery as combative and unbecoming. A particularly harsh opinion piece in The Hill pondered whether his personal convictions were impairing his objectivity as he slumped in his chair, the cold light of the monitor reflecting in his tired gaze. He'd anticipated resistance. Of course, the IT came with the territory. But this felt different, more pointed, more orchestrated. He raked a hand through his already tousled hair, feeling a familiar tendril of doubt begin to unfurl. Had he been too forceful? Was he allowing his personal views on the administration to color his reporting? Was he, as some alleged, becoming part of the problem rather than its remedy? A new email appeared. It was from his editor, Sarah. "Chad, please come to my office. We need to talk." The two sentences hung in the digital void like impending doom. Back at the White House, Karoline was luxuriating in the afterglow of her successful briefing. Congratulatory messages poured into her inbox. Her phone buzzed with encouraging texts from friends and family. Even her mother, usually a source of gentle critique, sent a message saying, "You were marvelous, darling, so poised and articulate." She permitted herself a moment to relish the triumph. Such moments were precious and fleeting in the volatile realm of the Trump administration. But even amidst the praise, a persistent unease gnawed at her. She knew that the next briefing, the next test, loomed on the horizon, and she knew that Chad Sterling wouldn't be easily discouraged. He was a determined adversary, fueled by conviction that, however misguided, she considered it, possessed undeniable force. She reopened her briefing book, turning the pages, already girding herself for the next confrontation. the economy, SNAP reductions, North Korea, China, the Mueller report. The issues churned within her mind like a tempest, and she, Karoline Leavitt, was the still center of that storm, tasked with navigating the dangerous currents of public opinion and political messaging. She picked up her pen, a Mont Blanc presented by a grateful donor, and began to scribble notes. The battle, she understood, was far from won. The next briefing. Lessons learned. The glare from his laptop painted Chad's face in a harsh chiaroscuro as he reviewed his past 6 months of reporting. Each article, each pointed question hurled across the briefing room, had felt like adding stone to a rampart constructed to defend the public from perceived economic wrongdoing by the administration. Now, viewed under the cold light of self-criticism, that rampart seemed less a defense and more a prison, confining him to his own self-righteous anger. His editor's directive echoed. Objectivity, Chad, that's why we're here. He massaged his throbbing temples. Objectivity, a concept he'd always dismissed as a fiction, a convenient crutch for those unwilling to commit. Lately, however, the faces of his interviewees, displaced factory workers, struggling entrepreneurs, coalesced into a unified, accusatory stare. Had his zeal for proving a point blinded him to their individual plights? Had he exploited their hardships to fuel his agenda? He skimmed the briefing transcript. Karoline Leavitt's composed, almost detached responses, so infuriating at the time, now struck him as masterfully crafted defenses, deflecting his blows with the grace of a seasoned diplomat. He'd arrived armed with data and passionate indignation. She'd come prepared with a chess strategy. He snapped the laptop shut. He craved a drink, a way to clear the mental fog. More importantly, he needed to redefine his role. Would he remain an activist masquerading as a journalist, or a reporter dedicated to truth, even when it shattered his own convictions? The answer, he realized, would chart his future course. Across town, Karoline Leavitt conducted her own assessment. The stark quiet of her office offered a sharp contrast to the bustling energy of the press briefing. Rotating in her leather chair, the soft squeak a solitary sound, she gazed at her framed, swearing-in photo, a concrete reminder of her vast responsibilities, the immense trust vested in her. She scanned the briefing transcript, pinpointing key phrases and identifying opportunities for sharper, more succinct responses. Sterling's queries regarding GDP projections had been anticipated, but his ambush regarding unemployment figures in former manufacturing states had been unexpectedly fierce. Though she'd evaded the trap, the exchange left a lingering prickle of unease. She tapped a pen against her teeth, considering the landscape. The media resembled a hydra, demanding constant sustenance, a narrative requiring relentless shaping. Sterling, though just one head, was a particularly tenacious one. She couldn't afford any underestimation. His playbook is transparent, she muttered. Emotional appeals, selective data, an attempt to paint a canvas of economic devastation. But he's predictable, nonetheless. She opened a fresh document and began outlining her strategy for the upcoming briefing. She needed compelling counter-narratives, figures illustrating a brighter picture, stories celebrating success against the odds. She would need to foresee Sterling's every gambit, redirect his attacks, and seize control of the narrative irrespective of the president's latest volatile pronouncements. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. This was more than a battle of wits. It involved managing perceptions, sculpting public sentiment, and safeguarding the president's agenda. The IT was about wielding influence. Her desk phone buzzed, a relentless reminder of the demands on her time. The caller ID displayed Steve Bannon's name. She sighed. The performance never ended. Karoline Leavitt, she answered, her tone polished and professional. Karoline, my girl. Bannon's voice roared through the speaker. Heard you grounded that lefty Sterling. Well done, but don't rest. The swamp festers, teeming with snakes. Vigilance is paramount. Understood, Steve, she replied, her voice measured. The president requests your presence in the Oval in 1 hour. He's got a new initiative brewing. Something colossal. Be ready to sell it. I will be, Steve. She replaced the receiver and leaned back, closing her eyes briefly to a new initiative, a new hurdle, a new chance to mold the story. She anticipated a more intense briefing, heightened scrutiny, but she felt ready. She had gleaned lessons from the last encounter, dissected her vulnerabilities, and formulated a strategy. Her eyes snapped open, reflecting a hard glint. The game was far from decided.